Thanks, Natalie. Well, lots to discuss. And joining me here now in the studio is Sama'a Al-Hamdani. She is the Yemeni analyst and commentator here. Also joining us in the studio is Fahad Nazer. He is a consultant to the Embassy of Saudi Arabia here in Washington, D.C. He's also a columnist for the publication Arab News. And joining us from Tehran is Mohammad Marandi. He's the Dean of the Faculty of World Affairs at Tehran University. And joining us from San Francisco is Richard Becker. He is coordinator for the group Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. Welcome, all of you, to the show. Sama'a, let's start with you. Obviously, high hopes that something might happen in Geneva, but just remind us, how bad is it on the ground right now in Yemen?
So they are, in fact, escalating the conflict while we are trying to get the consultations going in Geneva. There is some sort of escalation in Hodeidah. The fighting is still taking place on the ground. So the actual fighting has not stopped. And the hopes of this is, the consultation that's taking place in Geneva is to arrange for future talks. So the talks are likely to take place next month. And right now, the agreement is to get everyone together in one room to agree on how the negotiations are going to look like. And of course, with those are going to come some sort of agreements on whom to release, what kind of patients to take care of, and how to open the Sana'a airport. I expect that the most two important cities that they will look at is the port city of Hodeidah and the city of Taiz, where they're witnessing the most aggressive fighting on the ground. So these talks, they're going to want to find a way to kind of de-escalate those before they go forward with negotiations. So
these are quite limited aims here, sort of confidence-building measures. We're nowhere near a peace agreement.
Absolutely, because this war has taken many, many years at this point, and there have been several attempts at making negotiations happen. And I think the slow approach is actually reasonable because you don't end a war in 2 days. But the idea right now, it's really important to get everyone in the same room and to get them talking with each other, which has been really difficult to do because nobody wants to end this conflict or slow it down.
Yeah, before we go to the rest of our panel, I'd like to play a clip from Martin Griffiths. He's the UN Special Envoy for Yemen. You can kind of get a sense that although he's hopeful, there's a lot of progress to be made.
People of Yemen, like in any other conflict, are desperately in need of a signal of hope. We'd like to think that the work we will do together in these next days will begin to send a flickering signal of hope to them.
Fahad, here, you obviously consult with the Saudi Arabian government. You're a journalist. This war is essentially going on for 4 years, a Saudi-led coalition with the UAE and support from the US, UK, and others. Why is this war taking so long? And Saudi Arabia has come under intense criticism over its assault. What's going on here?
Well, I actually blame the conflict, the violence, and the civilian casualties on the Houthis. They began this conflict in the summer of 2014 when they took up arms against the internationally recognized government of Yemen. And since then, they have shown complete disregard for the safety and well-being of the people of Yemen. They have broken pretty much every norm and law pertaining to international relations and the laws of war. They have used human shields, they have used landmines, they've recruited children, they've used civilian centers, which has actually is the primary reason for most civilian casualties. So it is up to them, really. They started this conflict, and ultimately it is up to them to end it by putting down their weapons, withdrawing from the areas that they took over by force, and going back to the negotiating table.
Fahad, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that there have been lots of allegations on the Saudi side as well of atrocities. One thinks of the August 9th bombing where essentially a bus full of children on their way to look for graves was targeted and a massive loss of life. So this isn't just pointing fingers in one direction, surely.
Well, the coalition has acknowledged that mistakes have been made, but I think we have to draw a sharp distinction between mistakes and the targeting of civilians as a matter of policy. I think that is what the Houthis are doing in Yemen. And frankly, and unfortunately, but we really do have a current example of the level of devastation that does happen when you do have a party to a conflict that actually does target civilians as a matter of policy, and that's what we have in Syria. So whereas the figures in Yemen vary, but the casualties in Syria are upwards of 400,000 now. So I think that's something worth keeping in mind, and that the coalition has taken measures.
I don't get your point. You're comparing the lower number of casualties in Yemen and saying that Syria is worse because of?
Because of the intent. There's a sharp distinction between mistakes and intent. And I think, you know, the coalition has actually taken many measures. It has sought and received the assistance of the US and the UK to minimize collateral damage as well.
Well, Mohammad Marandi in Tehran, can you address those? The Houthi rebels are largely, well, widely thought to have the backing in some form from Iran, at least. How do you respond to our Saudi guest?
Well, first of all, I think it's quite clear that the Saudi regime and the UAE, they have committed enormous crimes against humanity. They have created a starvation siege with the help of the Americans. They have been preventing food from getting into the country for years. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, and because of starvation, malnutrition, and preventable diseases.
Okay.
And cholera, of course, we know has taken a huge toll in the country. And hundreds of thousands of children, if not millions of children, their growth has been stunted forever by this regime, these two regimes. And the United States has helped Saudi Arabia all along. They're just as much to blame for these crimes. Tens of thousands of people have been killed in the battles themselves. We've been hearing this artificially low estimate of casualties of 10,000 for almost 3 years now. If you look at, if you use a search engine and look at the old news on Yemen, 2.5 to 3 years ago was 10,000 people, and the numbers that we've been seeing in the past few months have still been 10,000. So obviously artificially kept low in order for Western companies and corporations that send hundreds of billions of dollars to be able to maintain these sales. The Saudis have bombed weddings, they've bombed hospitals, they've bombed funerals, they've bombed school buses. They've done every crime or criminal act in the book. And I think it's obvious that they would blame the victim, wouldn't they? Just like the Israelis, they surround Gaza, and they blame the Palestinians. The only difference is that the Yemen is much stronger. The Saudis have failed to gain any foothold anywhere near the capital for almost 4 years now.
Okay, Mohammed, I want to go to Richard Becker. Richard, we've seen some finger pointing, but the figures are awful, aren't they? We have, I'm just reading statistics from the UN and elsewhere, 28 million people in need of assistance, 8.4 million people on the brink of starvation, 3 million people have fled their homes. This is a terrible humanitarian crisis, yet one that many people in the West and the Middle East don't want to talk about, right?
It gets very little attention. Far too little attention in the United States media and the mainstream media here in the United States. And the United States is really more responsible, bears greater responsibility, I think, even than those who are carrying out the attacks directly, in that the United States has armed Saudi Arabia. It has trained the Saudi military. It refuels their attack planes in mid-flight. It would not be possible for Saudi Arabia and the UAE to be carrying out this intervention in a sovereign country. And I think it's, we have to point that out, that this is a sovereign country. Yemen is a sovereign country. And the conflict that was going on when the Houthis took the capital of Sana'a was entirely an internal conflict. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with the full backing of the United States, made the decision to intervene in a way that the previous speaker said has been so disastrous. 18,000 airstrikes have been carried out, and they've hit all kinds of civilian targets. They could not have avoided hitting civilian targets with that volume of airstrikes in the country. So this is a disaster, and the UN has brought up charges of war crimes, of torture, of targeting civilians, of rape, against the forces that are attacking from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Yemen. And, you know, and again, I think that left out of that picture because of its power is the United States out of those allegations. But the United States certainly bears responsibility for this terrible disaster.
Yeah, Sama'a, there's a lot of pressure now here in the US and in the UK, traditional arms suppliers of Saudi Arabia. I just want to play for you a clip of US President Donald Trump when he was sitting down with the Saudi Crown Prince back in March, because he seemed to sort of emphasize the arms sales to Saudi, and I want to get your reaction off the back.
Some of the things that have been approved and are currently under construction and will be delivered to Saudi Arabia very soon, and that's for their protection. But if you look in terms of dollars, $3 billion, $533 million, $525 million, that's peanuts for you. Should have increased it.
That sort of show and tell on arms sales, of course, and then the juxtaposition of the suffering we're seeing on the ground has not gone unnoticed in the US Congress. In fact, they're requiring the Trump administration to report on all this in the next few days or so. Are we going to see perhaps a US pullback from backing of this Saudi-UAE coalition?
Well, we've seen it in Spain, and we've seen that the Congress is trying here to restrict the sales. And there's been a lot of chaos in the last attack that was led by the Saudi coalition that targeted 40 children on a bus because the weapons were American-made. And so the U.S. is kind of feeling this ripple effect that they are, in fact, indirectly, or in my opinion, directly responsible for the deaths of these people.
Yes, the children's buses, they were American-made weapons.
They were from Lockheed Martin, and they have another pending sale that is on the table at the moment, where they're going to have to vote about whether this is going to proceed or not. And so we've seen some countries restrict these sales because of what's happening, and other countries want to sell. Of course, from the U.S.'s perspective, if they do not buy the weapons from us, they're going to get it elsewhere. But at the same time, the clip that you played me is a little like black comedy, laughing about, having these numbers, and what they're selling are pretty much weapons. They are killing people. And the fact is, Saudi Arabia has plenty of weapons already. The fact is, if we're gonna talk about the ethics and the intent of the targeting, how ethical is it to sell weapons to a country that is actively in war, that is actively targeting civilians, that is having accidents, several of them. Now, it's important for me to kind of just take a moment and revert back to what the other guests were saying. It's important to note that Yemenis are the victims in this, and they're victims of the Houthis, and they are victims of the Arab-led coalition, because they have the Houthis who are committing crimes on the ground against several people who oppose them. They are kidnapping people, they are killing people, they are infringing on their rights. They are a dictatorial regime, but at the same time, you have the Arab coalition coming in, not making things any better, comparing itself, a sovereign nation comparing itself to a group of rebels on the ground that took power illegally by saying, we're not as bad as them, when in fact the Yemeni civilian is paying the cost of this, first through inflation, the Yemeni rial completely collapsed, people can't provide for themselves, and then through the starvation and the lack of access to medication.
The pictures on the ground in the video have been horrific, and increasingly so. Fahad Nazer, as a Saudi, this must be difficult to bear. In just seeing all these pictures, do you see a position where Saudi Arabia can move towards some sort of peace agreement in the not too distant future? Right. Because the finger pointing that happened at the beginning of this show suggests no.
Sure, but I think what is, I do want to emphasize an important point here. What I feel is often lost in the conversation about the conflict in Yemen is the fact that the Houthis have actually launched thousands of mortars against Saudi Arabia, and by last count, 190 ballistic missiles, the last of which was yesterday.
How many people have they killed?
Hundreds, actually, of civilians. I don't have the exact same figure, but just last night, 26 people were injured in Najran in Saudi Arabia, including children. So this has been going on for a while. I was personally in Riyadh in April when a ballistic missile was intercepted over its skies. That's Riyadh, the capital, very far away from the Yemeni border. So the Houthis are obviously seeking everything. They're trying everything to do to escalate.
Do you mind if I just interrupt and move the conversation along? Nearly 4 years in, there hasn't been a breakthrough by Saudi Arabia and the coalition. Is it time to talk peace and accept the fact that you're not going to win?
Well, the coalition has always supported a political solution. Obviously, the Geneva talks are not the first attempt at this. There was talks in Kuwait 2 years ago that lasted over 100 days. And again, by all accounts, it was the Houthis that were absolutely resistant, reluctant to concede and just to move away from this notion that they can impose their will by force on the rest of Yemen. They have really very little, and this is coming from Yemeni officials, scholars, and activists that I talked to. The Houthis have very little support inside the country and almost no support outside the country, barring, of course, the primary rogue regime known as Iran.
Well, obviously, we don't know that because there's been no polls recently. Mohammad Marandi, in terms of the Houthi position and, of course, Iran, can we see some sort of peace emerging, or is it a little bit like Syria, where something has to be decisive on the battlefield, if you like, to get parties to talk and to agree to a path forward?
Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that there's no moral equivalence. It's like comparing in Gaza, saying the Palestinians and the Israelis are the same. There's no comparison. The Houthis, they are fighting in their own country, and the Saudis are fighting to occupy the country. And the Houthis, their attacks or their retaliation against Saudi Arabia is nothing compared to the atrocities that the Saudis are carrying out. The Saudis are starving the country. Food can't get in, help can't get in. But I think what is important to note is that we have to look at how Saudi Arabia functions. This is a country that has imposed a siege on Qatar. The Crown Prince has kidnapped the Lebanese Prime Minister. He engaged in a war on Yemen that he said he'll win. They said they'll win in a couple of weeks. It's been almost 4 years now. Okay. They supported extremists in Syria, as we know from WikiLeaks. We know from across the board. There are now documents coming out, the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, that the Saudis supported the extremists in Syria and Iraq. We know, for example, that what the Saudis did with Canada just a couple of weeks ago. This erratic behavior by the Saudi Crown Prince, the arrests of his family and the wealthy in the country, and then the release after this makes it very difficult for anyone to envisage that such a character, such a personality, such a person has a realistic view of the world. Otherwise, the Houthis and others in Yemen are willing to come to an agreement and form a coalition government. But the Saudis want absolute victory, and that's just not going to happen. If they were truly popular, they would have been able to take the capital for after almost 4 years. So the Saudis are just going until I think what's finally going to happen is that the Saudis are going to have increasingly internal problems. The war is becoming more and more expensive. And we saw what happened to the United States occupation in Iraq. The economic financial crisis in the United States was linked to the spending. And the Saudis are going to face the same catastrophe that other occupiers face.
Thank you. Richard Becker, I want to go to you. So how do we move forward here? Obviously, there is a growing reticence in Europe. Spain was mentioned about arms. The UK is under pressure. The US is under pressure. Do you think this will help force a movement towards diplomacy and some sort of peace process, or do you think we're not there yet?
I don't think that we're there yet because just last week, after the report, the UN report charging the Saudi and UAE forces with war crimes, the Secretary of Defense, so-called Secretary of Defense James Mattis in the United States, announced that the U.S. fully stood behind Saudi Arabia and supported the Saudi-UAE war and would continue to carry on that support. As long as that is the case, it's very hard to see how it would be possible for a real peace agreement. I think that's the #1 obstacle. As long as the coalition forces that are attacking Yemen feel that they have the backing of the world superpower, I think that they will continue to do this. I think they will fail in what they're doing. I mean, by all indications, after all these years of this intervention, they've caused just indescribable suffering among the civilian population, but they have not come anywhere close to achieving victory. So I think that we face the prospect of a protracted war, and I think that inside the United States, the forces that stand for peace and for internet justice and the international scene have to step up our efforts to demand an end to this terrible war and the end to the U.S. support, which is keeping the war going.
Sama'a, I'd just like you to pick up on that. Do you see any signs, for example, of Riyadh wanting to get out of this anytime soon, and also any movements by the large powers who affect the region? I'm talking about the US, Iran, and others, to also sort of move away from this, or is Yemen part of this regional face-off that we've been seeing increasing?
My personal analysis and take on this is that the U.S. would like to support Saudi Arabia and the UAE in everything they do, but it becomes harder for them to do so when there are civilian casualties, when they make, whenever there's a story about people starving. It becomes really difficult for the U.S. to publicly support them. And that's really clear when you look at Nikki Haley's speeches and the talks that she's giving at the UN. She would like to back the Saudi Arabia up because they view Iran as the main enemy, but at the same time, she cannot turn a blind eye at the humanitarian disasters that are happening in Yemen. And I think that because they're in this situation where they're seeing that this is putting a bad name on the American administration, they're having a hard time, they don't see a clear victory, I can see them putting pressure on all sides to come to a political settlement of some sort. And of course, having a British UN envoy doesn't hurt. In this case, the previous two...
Are you saying UN envoys can be political?
Well, what I'm saying is that it could really... This is the first time that there's genuine hope, and the fact that the process is not, they're not bragging about how successful it is, they're not claiming success before it's actually achieved, is actually giving Yemenis hope. Because ultimately, even if you stop the conflict completely, there are going to be pockets of conflict on the ground that are going to continue regardless. So this is going to be a mess that the world's going to have to take care of for a long time.
Fahad, is this Saudi Arabia's Vietnam?
No, I wouldn't characterize it that way at all. Again, this is a 10-member coalition. And again, as I said earlier, this conflict began as an internal conflict. It wasn't started by Saudi Arabia.
Is it popular at home?
I think Saudis absolutely support Saudi Arabia's right to defend its people and its borders and its territories. As I mentioned earlier, there have been hundreds. Popular? I think there's wide support for it. I think people do. Saudi Arabia, and I think every country in the region, including the internationally recognized government of Yemen, does want this conflict to end. However, I think they're the primary party, frankly, that doesn't seem very much interested in ending the conflict is Iran. Iran, as it has done in the past, has supported the Houthis. That's what it has done in the region.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I want to bring Mohammed in on that. Iran has said that it hasn't supported the Houthis, but we've seen the US ambassador to the UN display Iranian-made weaponry and the like. What's the situation? And if Tehran is backing them, why don't they back these peace talks necessarily?
Well, first of all, the U.S. claims are a joke. They show bits and pieces which say made in Iran on them, as if the Iranians are going to send weapons which have the Iranian flag and explicit information. That's fabricated news. The Americans do that when they want to frame other countries, like when in the invasion of Iraq, and so on. This is very old-style American misinformation. And of course, the Western media is complicit in these war crimes. They're not going to say anything, the mainstream media, that's going to run against U.S. policy in the region, whether it's Syria, Iraq, or Yemen, or Libya. They will abide, they will follow, they'll toe the line, as they say. So the Iranians, they do support the peace plan, any peace plan that accepts the legitimate rights of the people of Yemen. But Saudi Arabia, they are keen on absolute victory. Okay. And as one of your guests rightly pointed out, the Saudis have failed. It's been almost 4 years now. There is no internationally recognized government in Yemen that has any legitimacy inside the country, because it's after almost 4 years, they failed to even gain any access to the capital of the country. If they were truly popular, with all this firepower, with all this support from the West, with hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons that have been bought, and U.S. support in refueling jets and finding targets and helping to kill people in Yemen and to starve people in Yemen, if they cannot take the capital with all that support after almost 4 years, that means they do not have the legitimacy on the ground to do so.
Okay, Mohammed, thank you very much. I want to give the last word to Sama'a. I mean, we've almost come full circle here. Do you see any silver lining coming out of these consultations? As you correctly said, we're not talking about peace talks here
we're not there
in Geneva. And remember, Geneva's been the backdrop for Syria for, what, 7 years? Nothing's come out of that.
Absolutely. I think that Yemen is a little bit different than Syria in that the conflict is solvable. There is a way out. We haven't reached the point of no return. And to say that doesn't, I hope I'm not encouraging that we go to the point of no return. But I think Yemenis have to hold on to this consultation process as a way and means to peace, because otherwise there's nothing left on the ground. There's just inflation, there's unemployment, there is armed conflict, and there are, the majority of Yemenis are actually under the age of 25. So if we cannot save Yemen for the younger generation that's already scarred and is going to be suffering from tremendous post-traumatic stress disorder, then we have just created, the location of Yemen. If we do not save it, we are going to, the issues in Yemen are going to explode to its neighboring countries, and it's going to be not only a humanitarian disaster and something that is ethically wrong and hurting, but it's also something that could affect the neighboring countries, the stability of the region, and the future of the entire area there.
On that sobering note, we have to leave it. I want to thank both our guests here in the studio and also our guests from elsewhere. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King. Thanks so much for joining us. See you soon.